Hello friends, welcome back to our channel. I hope you all are well and doing great. So today I'm back with another video to continue our UCAT test preparation. So as you guys know, we have completed our three types of decision making, and if you wanted to watch our videos on verbal reasoning questions and the three types of decision making questions, tour tutorial, question bank tutorial, you can watch our last videos on this channel. So today I'm going to continue our start our video with the question number 17 of the interpreting information. This is a type of decision making. So without any further delay, let's start a question which says the charts show the costs of hotel rooms and the average amount spent in hotel resorts for families and couples during a 1 year period. So here we have a graph chart, you can see with this informations. So place yes if the conclusion does follow, and place no if the conclusion does not follow. So first we have that including hotel rooms, families spend more on their holidays than those in twin rooms. Second, family rooms and twin rooms do not share the same peak hotel room rate. More people stayed in twin rooms than in family rooms in April than in November. The average amount spent per day in the hotel resort in May is the same as in April. On average, the hotel makes more money per twin room than per family room. So here we have our first conclusion. It does not follow because the pie chart showing the average amount spent per room per day shows that those in twin rooms spend more on their holidays than families. So this one does not follow. So that's why we will drag a no in front of this conclusion. Second conclusion, which says that family rooms and twin rooms do not share the same peak hotel room rate. This conclusion does follow because the graph showing the hotel room rate per night shows that a twin room is consistently higher in price than a family room. So this one does follow. So that's why we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. So the third conclusion that says more people stayed in twin rooms than in family rooms in April than in November. It does not follow because we don't have enough information to know this. So that's why it again a no. So that's why we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. The fourth conclusion, which says the average amount spent per day in a hotel resort in May is the same as in April. So this one does not follow because we don't have information again to know this. So we will drop a no in front of this conclusion. The last conclusion that says does follow because the graph showing the hotel room rate per night shows that twin rooms are consistently higher in price, and the pie chart showing the average amount spent per room per day shows that those in twin rooms spend more money. So this one does follow, so that's why we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. The grid shows a plot of the leadership styles of 5 managers. Both the x-axis and the y-axis have a range of 0 to 9. So here we have leadership grid, the concern for people and the concern for production. So place yes if the conclusion does follow, and place no if the conclusion does not follow. So here we have our first conclusion, which says Jerome's leadership style is the hardest to diagnose. Second, Emily's leadership style is heavily task oriented and autocratic. Third, Jack's human oriented approach makes him the most efficient manager. Emily displays the greatest fear of jeopardizing relationships with team members. Sean's team has great potential to be productively efficient while being motivated and satisfied. So here we have these 5 conclusions. So let's see which one does follow and which one does not. So the first conclusion, that is Jerome's leadership style is the hardest to diagnose. This one does not follow because Jerome scores the least on both scales. His style can therefore be easily diagnosed as very inefficient in terms of production as well as team satisfaction. Erica's style is harder to diagnose than Jerome's, as she has a middle score on both scales. So that's why the first conclusion does not follow. So we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Second conclusion, that says Emily's leadership style is heavily task oriented and autocratic. It does follow because Emily scores high on the concern for production scale and low on the concern for people scale. It can therefore be concluded that her style is heavily task oriented and autocratic. So the second conclusion does follow, so we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. The third conclusion, that says Jack's human oriented approach makes him the most efficient manager. The third conclusion does not follow because Jack scores very low on the concern for production scale, which means his efficiency is low. So this one does not follow. So it means you will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. So here we have a fourth one, which says Emily displays the greatest fear of jeopardizing relationships with team members. It does not follow because Emily scores joint lowest on the concern for people scale, which means she has one of the lowest fears of jeopardizing relationships with team members. So this one again does not follow, so we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. So next we have the fifth conclusion, that is Sean's team has great potential to be productively efficient while being motivated and satisfied. It does follow because Sean scores a perfect 9 on both scales. This means that his team has the potential to be productively efficient as well as motivated and satisfied. So this one does follow, so that's why we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. This Asian giant contributes almost half of the world's surplus steel capacity of 700 million metric tons. However, it is not the only one responsible for the unprecedented rise in steel imports in the country and stands only as the 11th biggest exporter of steel to the country. The surge of similar cheap imports from Canada, Brazil, Japan, and South Korea has led to more than a 50% drop in the capacity utilization of the domestic steel mills, severely jeopardizing their sustainability. The weakening of the domestic industry, which has been the source of steel for aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, and military aircrafts, invokes a certain threat to national security. So place yes if the conclusion does follow, and place no if the conclusion does not follow. So here we have our first conclusion that says the steel industry in the country is experiencing a severe crisis. Second, the steel trade policy of the country needs to be revisited and revised. Third one says a stable home steel market would give a major boost to the country's economy. An increasing dependence on imported steel jeopardizes the country's defense system. The steel exports from other countries need to be curbed to revive the domestic industry. So here we have these 5 conclusions. So let's see which one does follow and which one does not. So here we have a first conclusion, that is the steel industry in the country is experiencing a severe crisis. It does follow because the passage mentions that the domestic steel industry has seen a major drop in capacity utilization due to cheaper steel imports. This affects the sustainability of the domestic industry. So this one does follow. That's why we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Next we have a second conclusion which says that the steel trade policy of the country needs to be revisited and revised. It does not follow because this is not stated or implied in the passage. So that's why we will drag a no and drop it here. Drag a no and drop it here. Now we have a third conclusion which says a stable home steel market would give a major boost to the country's economy. It does not follow because this is not stated or implied in the passage. So that's why we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Next we have a fourth conclusion which says it does follow because the last sentence mentions that all threat fall of the domestic steel industry poses a threat to national security. So as it does follow, so we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. The fifth conclusion, it does follow because the passage states that steel imports from other countries are jeopardizing the sustainability of the domestic steel mills. This implies that imports needs to be curbed to revive the domestic steel industry. So this one does follow. So we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Next we have sandstorms, volcanic ash, forest and grassland fires are bulk sources of aerosols that we inhale from seemingly clean air. Human activity, most of it from the north of the equator, contributes to the remaining 10% of the presence in the atmosphere. Not all types of these particles reflect or absorb sunlight to the same degree. Despite the fact that almost a quarter of the sunlight received is reflected back into space. Clouds with a high concentration of these particles are comprised of relatively smaller droplets, which makes them more reflective. This adds further to the net cooling effect, compensating for the entire increase by greenhouse gases. So place yes if the conclusion does follow and place no if the conclusion does not follow. So we have aerosols are tiny specks of matter that are harmful for the climate. The majority of the aerosol content in the atmosphere is due to environmental changes. The rise in temperature due to greenhouse gases is taken care of by these particles. Regions across the planet are equally instrumental in giving rise to manufactured aerosols. The average temperature is lowered as 25% of the sunlight is redirected away from the planet. So here we have a first conclusion, it does not follow because the passage does not state whether aerosols are harmful or useful for the climate. The last sentence suggests that aerosols may actually be useful in lowering the temperature rise caused by greenhouse gases. So it does not follow, so we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. So the second conclusion that says the majority of the aerosol content in the atmosphere is due to environmental changes. It does follow because the first and second sentences state the environmental changes account for 90% of the aerosol content in the atmosphere and human activity accounts for 10%. So we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this box. Then we have a third conclusion that the rise in temperature due to greenhouse gases is taken care of by these particles. This one does follow because the last sentence states that the net cooling effect caused by aerosols compensates for the entire increase in temperature caused by greenhouse gases. So it does follow, so we will place a yes in front of this conclusion. Fourth conclusion that regions across the planet are equally instrumental in giving rise to manufactured aerosols. It does not follow because the second sentence states that activity from the north of equator contributes to almost all the manufactured aerosol content in the atmosphere. So drag a no and drop it in that box. Fifth conclusion that says the average temperature is lowered as 25% of the sunlight is redirected away from the planet. This one does follow because the passage states that a quarter of the sunlight is reflected back into space by aerosols, and this contributes to a net cooling effect. So as it does follow, so we will drag a yes and drop it here. Next question we have that the country's corporate tax system that levies charges on profit making businesses to generate state revenue has been considered the least efficient. Tax rates as high as 50% in the 1970s have been cut down to more than half in recent years and are set to be at 17% in the coming years. However, the plummeting tax rate has not reduced the tax take for the government as expected because the tax base has been simultaneously broadening. The confidence level of businesses has risen, boosting investment in the event of economy turning more business friendly. This has sent profits on an upwards trajectory. Place yes if the conclusion does follow, place no if the conclusion does not follow. So the lowering of tax rate has led to a decline in the tax collected. Corporations are less likely to make business ventures because of the tax reforms. Corporations are making profits because of the rise in corporation tax rate. More and more corporations are coming under the ambit of corporation tax. Corporation tax is likely to reduce to as low as one-fifth of what it was before the tax reforms. So here we have a first conclusion that it does not follow because the passage states the tax take has not declined because the tax base has broadened. So we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this box. Second conclusion that does follow because the passage explains that state revenue has not decreased because the tax base has broadened. So we will drag a yes and drop it here. Third conclusion, it does not follow because corporation tax rates are falling. So we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this box. Fourth conclusion, it does follow because the passage states that the tax base is broadening. As it does follow, so we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. The fifth conclusion, it does not follow because corporation tax is set to reduce to 17%, which is higher than one-fifth of the tax rate before the reforms. So we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Next we have several demographic studies have estimated that more than half of the fertility decline during this period was due to a drop in childbearing among married couples. Post this period, however, it was attributed to a drop in marriage rates itself. Even within marriage, second and higher order births became a rarity as the goal of career advancement took over young professionals. Soaring housing costs, pricey childcare, and later education made traditionally preferred large families prohibitively expensive. Eventually, as the rates hit record lows, policymakers brought in pro-natalist programs like cash incentives for single-income families with toddlers. Apprehending resentment from feminist groups, these were later extended to include families with working mothers as well. Place yes if the conclusion does follow, and place no if the conclusion does not follow. Raising children added to the cost of working parents. The aging population in the country is at an all-time high. Young adults preferred to remain unmarried or choose next not to extend their families. Fertility rates remain depressed due to limited measures introduced by the government. As marriageable age increased, children with higher birth orders had more congenital defects. So the first conclusion, it does follow because the passage mentions that the high cost of childcare and later education was a factor that made having large families expensive. So as it does follow, we will place a yes in front of this conclusion. Second conclusion, it does follow because the passage refers to fertility rates and no to aging population. So we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Third conclusion, it does follow because the first and second sentences mention that couples during the time either choose not to have children or choose not to marry at all. This one does follow, so we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. The fourth one does not follow because nothing of the sort is suggested in the passage. So we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Fifth conclusion does not follow because nothing of the sort is suggested in the passage. So again we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. During a study, it was found that a reduction of 5 mm Hg in a systolic blood pressure reduced the chances of stroke by 12%. The table shows the individual impact of lifestyle interventions on blood pressure during the study. So here we have some lifestyle interventions for lowering blood pressure. Intervention, change in systolic blood pressure, millimeter mercury, change in diastolic blood pressure, and then we have some recommendations. So please yes if the conclusion does follow, and please no if the conclusion does not follow. A person who has lost 2 kg in weight is likely to reduce the chances of stroke by 12%. Half an hour of daily aerobic exercise is likely to lower the diastolic blood pressure of a person from 99 to 90. A person who is on a natural diet along with fat-free milk is likely to lower the blood pressure the most. Consolidating 3 or more interventions would lead to an addictive effect on change in blood pressure. Most interventions have a more pronounced effect on systolic blood pressure compared to diastolic blood pressure. So here we have these conclusions. So let's see which one does follow and which one does not. So the first conclusion does not follow because a person who has lost 2 kg in weight is likely to lower systolic blood pressure by 4 mm mercury. But a 12% lower risk of stroke is achieved by lowering systolic blood pressure by at least 5 mm mercury. So that's why the first conclusion does not follow. So we will drag a no in front of this conclusion. We will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Second conclusion, it does not follow because 30 to 40 minutes of physical activity lowers diastolic blood pressure by only 2 mm mercury. So again it does not follow, so we will drop a no in front of this conclusion. Third conclusion does follow because DSH diet is likely to reduce systolic blood pressure by 11 millimeter mercury and diastolic blood pressure by 5 millimeter mercury, which is highest among all interventions. So it does follow, so that's why we will drag a yes and drop it here. Fourth conclusion, it does not follow because multiple interventions do not appear to have an additive effect in the table. So we will drag a no and drop it here. Fifth conclusion does follow because for all interventions, systolic blood pressure is lowered more than diastolic blood pressure. So it's a yes, so we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. The table shows the 4 levels of cognitive complexity that students of a particular course are expected to develop by the end of the course. So here we have cognitive complexity levels. In levels we have A, B, C, D, and then we cognitive complexities in front of these levels. Place yes if the conclusion does follow and place no if the conclusion does not follow. The cognitive complexity demand of level B is the highest. Production of a rote response reflects proficiency in level C. A student who is able to display whether information graphically is proficient in level B. Proficiency in level C can be best tested using paper and pencil in a traditional classroom environment. The ability to choose an appropriate building material based on the knowledge of heat transfer reflects proficiency in level A. So the conclusion 1 does not follow because the ability to recall specific information is much simpler than other cognitive demands mentioned in the table. So as it does not follow, we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this box. Drag it here and then transfer it into that box. Next we have a second conclusion. It does not follow because the production of a rote response reflects proficiency in level B rather than level C. So again it's a no, so we will drag a no and drop it here. The third conclusion does follow because level D demands the ability to represent data. If a student is able to plot weather data on a graph, the student must be proficient in level D. So as it does follow, it means it's a yes, so we will drop it here, a yes in that box. So the fourth conclusion, it does not follow because the ability to research over an extended period of time cannot be tested using traditional paper and pencil tests in a classroom environment. So it does not follow, so it means we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. The fifth conclusion does follow because the ability to transfer or apply the concept of heat transfer to the context of building materials reflects proficiency in level A. So as it does follow, we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. A survey was conducted to understand consumer attitudes towards internet neutrality in 2 countries in our region. The graph shows the percentage of respondents who agreed with the various statements. The rest of the respondents either did not agree with the statements or did not respond. So here we have internet neutrality debate trends with some statements. So first conclusion we have that users in the region believe the internet should be a highly democratic medium. Concerns about online privacy were evenly matched in two countries. Third, the majority of users supported a lack of regulations and greater autonomy for ISPs. The users in the region showed a clear preference towards a stable internet experience. Users in the region generally lack awareness about the dynamics of a competitive telecom market. So let's see which one does follow and which one does not. So here we are, first conclusion. It does follow because 100% and 80% of users agree that all users should have access to all content. Additionally, 90% and 80% of the users agree that all users should have access to equal speeds. Therefore, users in the region believe the internet should be a highly democratic medium. So the first conclusion does follow the statement of the question, so we will drag a yes and drop it here. And the second conclusion, it does not follow because 100% in country X and only 60% of users in country Y agree that ISPs should not monitor what people do online. So it's a no, that's why we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Third conclusion does not follow because 60% of users in country Y and 40% of users in country X agree that ISPs should be able to decide which applications they want to provide access to. This means that 40% of users in country Y and 60% of users in country X either did not agree on the same or did not respond to the statement. Therefore, opinion is equally divided, and it cannot be said that the majority of users supported a lack of regulations and greater autonomy for ISPs. So the third conclusion does not follow. So that's why I will drag a no and drop it here. Now we have a fourth conclusion. It does follow because 90% of users in country X and 80% of users in country Y agree that regulators should ensure equal speed to all users, which means that users prefer a stable internet experience. So it does follow, that's why we will drag a yes and drop it here. Then we have a fifth conclusion that it does not follow because although only 40% of users in country X and only 20% in country Y agree that competition among ISPs prevents discriminatory practices. The remaining users may not agree with the statement or may not have responded to the statement. Therefore, to conclude that users are not aware of this particular issue would be incorrect. So the fifth conclusion does not follow, so it's a no. So we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Figure of speech and rhetoric are considered as the art of language. The latter has often been used as a powerful persuasive tool in the arsenal of orators and political leaders to accomplish desired outcomes. To endure this competitive world that often manifests during job interviews, college admissions, marketing, academic, and professional projects and presentations. The knowledge of effective persuasion techniques offers great utilitarian value, invoking trust by convincing the audience of their ethos or credibility. Is one of these classical persuasive appeals that is available to a speaker. Pathos is an appeal that rests on the power of human emotion. And the last and the most superior is logos, an appeal to reason. So place yes if the conclusion does follow and place no if the conclusion does not follow. Classical rhetoric as described is of innumerable types. Classical rhetoric is of limited use in our day-to-day routine lives. The various techniques of persuasion may be used in oral and written communication. Convincing the audience based on statistical figures and factual data is using logos to persuade. When the spokesperson of repute vouches for a product, the product company banks on their ethos. So here we have our first conclusion. It does not follow because classical rhetoric is described is of three types: ethos, pathos, and logos. So as it does not follow, we will drag a no and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Second conclusion does not follow because the passage mentions that rhetoric is used in our day-to-day routine lives, during job interviews, college admissions, marketing, etc. So again it's a no, so we will drag a no and drop it here. Third conclusion, it does follow because the passage mentions that persuasive techniques have been used by orators and also during academic and professional projects and presentations. So it does follow, we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. So the fourth conclusion, it does follow because logos has been described as an appeal to reason. Reason is the ability to think logically based on facts. So as it does follow, we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this box like this. Then we have a fifth conclusion. It does follow because the ethos as described is about using the credibility of the speaker to convince the audience. So again, this conclusion does follow the statement of the question, so it's a yes. We will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Next we have question number 27. Eating disorders, body dissatisfaction, and low self-esteem are not uncommon outcomes in young people who are constantly exposed to stereotyped portrayals of the thin ideal body image that is projected by the media. Having unhealthy thin celebrities as role models itself sets a dangerous trend among adolescents, leading to a anorexic tendencies and other health harming behaviors. Compelling some countries to legislate against the use of model of below average BMWI. Contrary to these facts, the results of various parallel studies also indicate that the depiction of well sculpted women in media may have only limited impact on the viewers, whereas the positive impact created by images of overweight women. Please guess if the conclusion does follow. Please know if the conclusion does not follow. The younger generation is vulnerable to feelings of physical inadequacy and dissatisfaction. People with an above average BMWI are often treated as an object of ridicule in popular media. The media is acting irresponsibly when it comes to projecting the ideal body image. Countries are making laws to prevent false portrayals of bodies being created by advertising. Women and men across all age groups face the perilous consequences of the effects of media on body image. So here we have a first conclusion. It does follow because the passage mentions that young people often experience body dissatisfaction. So it's a yes. So we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Second conclusion does not follow because this is not mentioned in the passage. So as it does not follow, so we will drag a no and drop it in front of this conclusion. Third conclusion does follow because the underlying tone of the passage suggests that the media often create an unhealthy body ideal that is physically and psychologically harmful. So this statement does conclusion does follow the statement of the question. So we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Now we have a fourth conclusion which says countries are making laws to prevent false portrayals of bodies being created by advertising. This conclusion does follow because the passage states that countries are legislating against the use of models of below average BMI. So as it does follow, so we will drag a yes again and drop it here in front of this conclusion. Drag it and drop it here. We have a last conclusion which is the fifth one which says women and men across all age groups face the perilous consequences of the effects of media on body image. It does not follow because the passage largely mentions the negative impact of a false body image on young people or adolescents and not across all age groups. So this one does not follow. So we will drag a no and drop it here like this. Next question we have the question number 28 which says from 1996 to 2001 American drug giant Purdue Pharma held more than 40 national pain management symposia hosting thousands of American doctors and pharmacists with the aim to drill into them promotional material about OxyContin. This semi-synthetic opioid, loosely related to morphine and originally based on elements of the opium poppy, was aggressively marketed as a non-addictive chronic pain remedy. Overprescribed due to numerous incentives, OxyContin becomes a go-to drug for any kind of pain, but many addicts abused it by grinding the pills up to snort for a potent high, fueling an opioid epidemic. So place yes if the conclusion does follow, and place no if the conclusion does not follow. Purdue Pharma misrepresented the harmlessness of their product to medical professionals. American doctors and pharmacists were bullied into prescribing OxyContin. OxyContin started out as a part organic drug for persistent pain. Claims of OxyContin's known addictiveness was the main reason for it being prescribed more often than necessary. Patients are partially to blame for the escalation of the opioid problem. So the first conclusion does follow because OxyContin was aggressively marketed as known addictive when in fact it was addictive. So it does follow, so we will drag a yes and drop it here. Second conclusion does not follow because while the passage states that the marketing was aggressive, numerous incentives were given out and the symposia drilled the promotional materials into them. The doctors were not forced into prescribing it, so we will drag a no and drop it here. Third conclusion, it does follow because the passage states that it originally was based on elements of opium poppy and marketed as chronic pain remedy. So it's a no, yes, so we will drag a yes and drop it here. Fourth conclusion does not follow because the passage states that the drug was overprescribed due to numerous incentives. So while it was marketed as non-addictive, the incentives were the main reasons. So the fourth conclusion does not follow. So we will drag a no and drop it here. And the fifth conclusion, it does follow because many of them abused it by grinding the pills up to snort for potential high and hence fueled an opioid epidemic. So the fifth conclusion that says patients are partially to blame for the escalation of the opioid problem. This one does follow the statement from the question. So that's why we will drag a yes and drop it here in front of this question. So I think this is enough for today. I hope you guys understand each and every point that I have discussed in this video. If you still have any confusion, you can ask me in the comment section. I'm surely be here to reply you whenever you comment in. And if you want to watch our last videos, you can watch on this channel on tour tutorial, question bank tutorials, and on the verbal reasoning practice questions. Every video is available in this channel. And if you wanted to buy any one of our book and other household products, you can buy it from our website, which link is available in the description box below. Okay, so I'll be back with another video to continue our next question. As we have completed our 28 question in this video, we will start our next question, that is question number 25, in the next video for UCAT test preparation. If you like our video, if you enjoy it, if you understand each and every point, then don't forget to press the like button on our every video, and don't forget to share it as much as you can. So I'll be back with another video. Till then, just take care and goodbye.